Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Good evening and welcome to another ISRA lecture. My name is Orhan Kaba. I'm your MC for this evening, and on behalf of ISRA, I extend you all a warm welcome and I hope you enjoy tonight's program. The lecture for tonight is, can engineers, doctors, lawyers and any other professionals for that matter become scholars of Islam? The lecture will be delivered by Associate Professor Mehmet Ozalp, and I know it's a topic close to his heart. Our program tonight will include the lecture, a short Q&A period following the lecture, and following this we invite you all to hang around for some refreshments and a bit of more of an informal meet and greet out in the hallway there. We will be breaking for Maghrib prayer at about 7:55, so the brothers we can pray upstairs and the sisters there'll be a room down here for you to pray. So the lecture will be cut into two parts. So Associate Professor Mehmet Ozalp is a theologian, author and academic. He studied Islamic theology and religious disciplines between 1990 to 1998. He has completed a Masters in Religion from the University of Sydney. Mehmet has been teaching religious and Islamic studies since 1992. He was one of the first to teach Islamic courses in English from 2000 onwards. He has developed and written material for numerous courses on Islamic theology, history and contemporary issues around Islam, including a 4-year advanced course titled Theology of Quran. Mehmet has lectured in Islamic courses as part of Sydney University's continuing education program from 2003 to 2008. He has also lectured on Islamic theology, culture and history at the University of Newcastle from 2006 to 2009. Mehmet founded ISRA Australia, an educational and research organisation focusing on providing information and educational services on Islam and Muslims. Mehmet has been the recipient of the following awards: CSU Professional Excellence Award 2012, Muslim Role Model of the Year 2012, and Australian Blue Star Award Education 2011. He is the author of 3 books, 101 Questions You Asked About Islam, and Islam in the Modern World, and Islam Between Tradition and Modernity, an Australian Perspective. Without further ado, I now call him to the lectern to present his lecture. Thank you.
Or being a doctor, engineer, or a lawyer, or any other profession. Again, these 3 ones are just archetypes of some of the well-known professions. So what happens is that people actually hide their professions as if it's something to be ashamed about. And or if they disclose that they have an engineering or legal, some sort of a professional background, people automatically, because of the criticisms being done so much, people automatically reduce their level of learning. I mean, they may have read 50 books to become an engineer. They may have studied 500 books on Islam and studied it with people, and still they're not accepted as scholars. So I think this is a big problem, because majority of our communities, especially those in the West, do come from professional backgrounds. And my argument, I will argue today that not only professional people should study Islam and become scholars, we actually need them. And the traditionally trained scholars or sheikhs should actually study other professions and disciplines in order to solve the problems of the Muslim world. So this is going to be my argument. Keep that in mind. I'm actually arguing the reverse. I will put forward a case while many others actually become critical of professionals getting into Islamic disciplines. I will put forward the case that they actually make good Muslim scholars, and actually we need them. So I'm going to do this in 3 ways. Firstly, I'll analyze and explain why professional people are attracted to Islam and the study of it, and that they very quickly get into teaching. That needs to be explained. It's a phenomena, and it's an important phenomena, and I don't think we can stop that. Secondly, I will explain why having one area of expertise, whether that's Islamic or non-Islamic, is not enough to address the problems of the Muslim world, because they are very complex and they require many disciplines to take place. And thirdly, obviously, it would be incomplete to address this topic if we did not outline the conditions of becoming a Muslim scholar, minimum conditions. And you will see even that will prove the point that we do need people to get out of their disciplines and start venturing into areas that they haven't studied, religious or otherwise. Okay, so let's begin that process. So I said that my first premise is that there are three important reasons why professional people are attracted to Islam, and they study Islam, and they're also activists. First one is that they bring with them, professional people bring with them key skills and competencies that are necessary to address problems Muslims are facing in this world. You know, Muslim world has been colonized, the traditional Islamic societies have collapsed, and then Muslims have been building ever since for the last 100 years or so. And in that building process, you need a lot of professional people, and the professional people bring very important skills and competencies that are necessary to address this problem. Let's take, for example, the three professions that we mentioned. We mentioned lawyers, right? What are lawyers good at? Lawyers are very good at in constructing arguments and backing up with evidence or defend an idea or an angle. They're very good at that. That's what they do every day in the courts. And that's why they're also very articulate. They can really convey an idea very clearly, because they're all faced with a point to prove in the courts. And it becomes a malaka or sifat. You know, this is what I mean by competency. When someone does that many times, it becomes a second nature. And what do Muslims need today? Exactly that. Like, they are faced with questions, criticisms, misconceptions about Islam that they feel they have to defend. So lawyers are very good at that. Okay, that's lawyers. What about doctors? What is the key skill and competency of a doctor? Diagnosing a disease and then providing a prognosis, a solution, and a remedy to that. Well, do Muslims as individuals have diseases? Spiritual, intellectual diseases? Yes. Muslim societies, governments, they've got massive problems that need to be diagnosed, and then prognosis have to be provided. Therefore, doctors are very good at that. And when they speak or they look at issues in a way that most people don't. And they are usually accurate in that sense. So let's take engineers. What is the key competence of an engineer? Engineers are problem solvers. They see a problem and they identify the problem, they go to the root cause of that problem, and they design something, use a technology to design a way, system, processes, or equipment or device to get rid of that problem. Or they make our lives easier by use of technology. Once again, the skills that Muslim world desperately needs. And we can do this for anything, because every profession brings with it a key competence and skill that become second nature to a person. Like I had a brother, his job is an estimator, construction estimator. What that means is that he works out how much a construction will cost. So he has to go and look at each part, and then usually estimate or guess a ballpark figure. When I asked him to do a project, he was applying the same things to the project, estimating everything, which was not good in that case, because the project required a precise, the doctor sort of precision. So actually, another aspect of professional people is that they work in the real world, especially in the Western world, in corporations. Like when you work in a corporation, you learn how to do work in a teamwork. You learn how to run meetings, have a proper agenda before you run a meeting, have minutes afterwards. These may seem simple, but when somebody has that in a community organization or a religious organization or a movement, when somebody can do that, when others, these professional people quickly rise up within that organization or the volunteer group, and they hold a prominent position straight away. I tell you, one of the most developed disciplines in our time is the leadership and management disciplines. There are 600,000 books written on that, just that. Why? Because there are so many corporations and there's massive research going on all the time. And they are well funded. Business schools in universities are the most valuable and also expensive schools in universities. So professional people usually, by virtue of working in a professional corporate world, they bring in very important skills to a religious organization or a movement. Therefore, they become valuable. And they quickly rise up through the ranks, because when they rise up through the ranks, teaching comes as an outcome of that. Another important aspect that professional people bring or have is that they're always dealing with people and society. When you're a doctor, you're seeing many patients every day. When you're a lawyer, you're always dealing with people. And it's not a transactional relationship. You go down into people's lives in detail. And that enables them to see the world in a different way to other professions. I'll tell you, in the, Mongols, when they invaded the Muslim world, and it was very destructive. Like Mongol invasion was the most destructive invasion that Muslim world has ever faced. What happened in the end? Mongols converted to Islam, and they actually spread Islam. Do you know how they converted? This is not well known, and let me explain very briefly, without digressing too much. When Mongols invaded or captured a city, they usually separated people into children, young men and women. They were enslaved because they're useful as a labor force. Soldiers were executed straight away. And the craftsmen were separated and spared. Everyone else was executed. And you know what they did with the craftsmen? They took them back to Mongolia. Why? Because they're valuable. Because they know things, they know how to make carpenters, blacksmiths and so on. And these, the craftsmen also are very good at ethics and how to deal with people. So when they went to Mongolia, they were very quickly became people appreciated them. They liked their character and they interacted with them, so they could explain Islam very quickly. So that was one of the main mechanisms how Mongols converted to Islam. Now this lecture is not about, conversion, but I'm making the point that why professional people are always valued, because they bring with them important skills that any society needs, and Muslim world needs them and desperately. So that's my first point, that professionals bring with them very important skills and competencies that are necessary. The second point why professional people enter into teaching like scholar and medium is that they are amongst the most talented people and intellectual and smart people. And they have great aptitude for learning, and therefore they often progress in learning far quicker than anyone else in a group, in an organization or a movement. And let me explain how this works as well. Now, every era, every time period, every country, society has certain things that are esteemed, that are held high by the people of that society, especially professions. Now, when we go back to the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, or Sahaba, and the first couple of generations, what was the most important knowledge, skill, competency, profession one could have? Knowledge of the Quran, knowledge of the Hadith, knowledge of Islamic law. Therefore, a lot of people studied these disciplines. Actually, that was the only education that was provided. So if you wanted higher learning, you went and studied Islam. So what happens is that, and also not just that, the whole society is designed around that learning. What happens is that the most talented people then compete in a positive way for the best jobs, highest paying jobs, and the most coveted professions. And that was all Islamic in that first couple of centuries and thereafter. Like for example, Sufyan al-Tharwi was complaining that people came to study with him to get a profession. So for him, studying Islam had to be done in its own right, not to get a profession. But it shows you why people were studying in that time. So what happens is that when the big, large pool of people study the same thing, the genius, the most talented and the most intellectual rise up to the top. And that's why you have people like scholars like Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi'i, many scholars have become qualified to teach at the age of 14, 15, 16. Like Ibn Sina says in his memoirs, that he says, I've studied, I memorized the Quran, I studied Islamic law, tafsir, hadith, then I went on to philosophy, I studied mathematics, and then I went into medicine, because medicine was the most developed of all sciences. Because when I finished all of that, I was 18 years old. So he was a child prodigy, like very smart, intellectual person, and naturally you get a lot of people. So what happens in our time is the opposite. What is the most coveted job? Doctor, lawyer, engineer, psychologist, and these things like this. So when in our time, the things that are coveted and held esteem are not Islamic learning, which is a shame. And but what happens is that the talent pool that the Muslim world has goes into other disciplines, the professions. Again, I don't think that the intelligence level of the people at the time of Imam al-Shafi'i in 8th century is not any higher than the intellectual level of people in our time. Yeah. Actually, people in our time have more access to information and education. But it's all directed into different areas. That is the issue. And I don't know, those of you who are a little bit old enough to know, or if you have migrated from a Muslim country, do you know those old movies? Turkey, Egypt, or Middle Syria, they play the hero is always a doctor, and or an engineer. He goes to America, studies, and comes back, is good looking, and then he becomes a doctor. He goes to a town, and all the girls, eligible bachelors, they pretend to be sick so that they can be treated by this doctor. They all want to get married to this amazing guy. So all these movies, they glorified these professions. So naturally enough, I'll finish this argument then we'll stop. Naturally enough, people actually direct their kids to these professions, become doctor, lawyer, and so on. And also young people, they don't know enough. They whatever makes most money and also has held coveted, they go for those professions. Sheikhul Islam in Ottoman Empire was paid the most. He was the top judge. So what happens is that later, when these smart people, talented people who study, being doctor, professor, engineer, lawyer and so on, when they become religious, they come back to studying Islam. So if we stop them to do that, you're actually stopping the most talented and smart people of studying Islam. And we need them to get into this field. And I want to stop at that point. We'll break for Maghrib prayer, and we'll come back, inshallah, continue the discussion. The study of Islam is the esteem that knowledge has within Islam. That's why when you become religious and you get interested in religion and you start practicing, when you read up Quran, Hadith, it's full of material that encourages learning and knowing. So it's a natural path for a Muslim to take the path of learning. And that is true for every Muslim, not just professionals. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, he said, the prophets do not live behind dinars or dirhams, they live behind a body of knowledge. And the scholars are the inheritors of this knowledge. So actually Islam, the religion itself, it's put on the shoulders of scholarship and knowledge. And especially, so the ulama became important in that sense. Even in the early first generation of the Prophet ﷺ and the companions. And thereafter, in the following generations, unfortunately, some big fitna or civil wars and political events that took place in the Muslim world, it made it very clear in that debate, and by experience, the Ummah, the worldwide Muslim community, realized that you cannot leave Islam and the knowledge of Islam in the hands of politicians or rulers, because they will, for political expediency, utilize religion because religion is power. So the scholars, that's why ulama became more important, especially in the Sunni tradition, because that in the Shia tradition, the line between politics and religion is still there, because in the Imam, identity of the Imam. But in the Sunni tradition, they said, you are the ruler, we are the scholars, we represent religion and knowledge. You rule according to the principles of Islam. You don't represent Islam. I think this is a very important wisdom and learning that our predecessor scholars had, and we need to come back to that in our time as well, because problems are coming out in the Muslim world. So, therefore, it's not surprising that professional people will be attracted to the study of Islam, and they're going to be good at it when they do, because they're talented and intelligent, and also they bring with them added skills and competencies that are very useful for Muslim organizations and movements. I think this is a very important case. But I'll now move on to my second premise, and that is Muslim world and Islamic scholarship needs scholars who combine two wings of knowledge. That is Islamic disciplines and what we call scientific disciplines. And now, there are some, and why is this so? Why do we need that? Now, this is very important as well. And I'm going to give you 3 reasons for that. The first one is that there are some disciplines that are traditionally classified as non-Islamic or scientific discipline that needs Islamic disciplines or Islamic knowledge to be brought into it. For example, psychology. I mean, if you study psychology without studying Islamic theology and spirituality, you'll go mad. I don't know if there are psychologists in this room, I've met a lot of psychologists. Unfortunately, I also had a friend when I was going to university who studied psychology, later committed suicide. We had long religious discussions, but unfortunately, he was too messed up. So there are important disciplines out there that if you bring Islamic knowledge, it will really broaden that, open new avenues in that knowledge, and actually help people. Without taking into account the human soul, like deeper aspects of meaning and life, how can you address psychological issues? So it beats me. And you just give drugs, and that's it. And people walk around like zombies. But there are also Islamic disciplines where bringing in another discipline would enrich that discipline. And that will help you deal with issues that we're facing in the Muslim world. And Islamic law, for example, the really core of Islamic disciplines. In Australia, for instance, if you want to study divorce and marriage, and we are having some problems, right, in the Western societies, Muslims especially, with divorce. And how are you going to address that just studying Islamic law? You can't. You have to know the common law, the Western legal system as well. And only then you can see the problems and actually provide a solution that is workable both for Muslims and Australian people and the system here. And actually, I've attended a book launch. Dr. Rina Krayam and Professor Selim Ferrar just produced a book called, Islam and Sharia and Common Law in relations to marriage and other matters. I haven't read it yet. It was launched this week, so I got the book. Inshallah, I will read it. So, and then thirdly, there are some issues that the world is facing that cannot be solved by one or two disciplines. It requires experts from many disciplines to come together and solve it. Climate change, for example. Climate change, how would Muslims make up 1.6 billion people on the world? Muslim behavior and what we do in our societies, economies, affect the world, doesn't it? So Islamic response to climate change is very important. But how are you going to address that? If you just study traditional Islamic disciplines, it's not enough. Actually, some years ago, we wanted to do an interfaith event. It was an imam, rabbi, and a priest on climate change. It sounded very good. We were going to get a rabbi, priest, and an imam. And we, as the Muslim organization, we had to organize an imam. And I went to one of the imams in Sydney, and I said, this is what we want to do, climate change, this, that. And you know what he said? He says, what is climate change? Then I had to give him a half an hour, crash course on climate change. And then after that, he said, oh yeah, there's that verse, this verse. He started to, get some ideas around it. You don't just need a climate change and environmental expert. You also need an economist, politicians, people from many disciplines coming together to address that problem. Because climate change is a product of the sum total of all human action on this planet. So this is why Tariq Ramadan, for example, in his book, Radical Reform, it sounds bad, for Muslims, but he wasn't saying, let's change everything. He was saying, let's change differently, very differently, in the way we understand ijtihad. And he was saying that we can improve it, the ijtihad process. And one of the key ideas that he was proposing in that book was science as a universe is created by God, Quran is revealed by God. Studying both, bringing both as sources of knowledge is important. And it will be incomplete when we approach it one without the other. This is not a new idea. Imam Ghazali talked about it, Said Nursi talked about it. But he was sort of applying that to Islamic law, saying that when we are making ijtihad, you just having a jurist, a Sharia expert is not enough. You got to bring in people from other disciplines, and as a committee, you should have an ijtihad. And he said, not even this committee comes and informs the imam or the jurist, because they have to be equal. Because knowledge of the universe and knowledge of the revelation is equal at the end of it. as being the product of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I think this is a really good approach. Like, how would you address stem cell research, an ethical position on ijtihad on stem cell research? I don't think there's any Sharia expert out there who knows the biology involved and the research involved in that field. So you got to bring in other experts. So what this means is that we either have to have scholars who are multidisciplinary, they are polymath. You almost have to be a polymath in our time. At least enough in critical mass of them, because they're the ones who will bring all these experts together and manage it. And then you need really good hadith scholars, really good still tafsir scholars and doctors who know nothing about Islam, but they can still be brought together and come to a particular decision or ijtihad. So therefore, Muslims with different disciplines, professions are very important. And they also have to be interested in Islam for them to just agree on a collaboration. So we need professionals know about Islamic disciplines, and scholars with Islamic disciplines know about different disciplines as well. I'll come back to that in my third main premise. But I just want to know, the possibilities are endless in this. Even theological matters could be addressed this way. Like theology, the things that you believe. And I'm saying that you can still bring in professions. Let me give you an example. In books of Aqidah and theology, qadar discussion, about human destiny, human will, it's a very important question. Do humans have free will? And something called power to act. That how do you have power to act, and when do you have it? The traditional Islamic idea is that power to act, you don't have it. It's given to you at the moment of action. But scholars came up with this without knowing physiology properly, or limited physiology knowledge of their time. But now we can do brain scans. We can look at the cells, what's happening to muscle cells when you're actually making an action. We can settle this question once and for all. All you need is a theologian partnering with a neuroscientist or a physiology expert, and we can do this problem. Actually, I'm ready to do this research. I'm really curious. If there's any neuroscientist in this room or listening to this, contact me, please. We can do this research together. So the possibilities are endless when we look at these issues in an interdisciplinary manner. And that is only possible if we do not confine knowledge or Islamic knowledge to just study of classical sciences. In my view, studying astronomy is an Islamic knowledge. Studying human brain, how human brain works, human physiology works, is an Islamic discipline. But it's a different discipline within that big umbrella. So you need the professional people will be attracted to learning, and they will be involved. We need them. And that not only that, we need scholars, Muslim scholars learning other disciplines, and vice versa. So the third point that I'm making is that obviously, my main argument is that professional people can be good scholars, and we need them, but on the condition that they study Islam properly. That is obviously, no one would disagree with that, right? As long as you put the time and energy. But my earlier introduction was that even when somebody does that, just because they have a professional background, they're looked down upon. That's what I want to change. It's actually, they have additional skills and competencies and knowledge which makes them higher You know, in science, in actually relativistic physics, for example, you know, E equals mc squared. What that means is that matter equals energy, or matter can be expressed in the terms of energy. So what scientists say is that when you have a spring, you know, just loose, when you actually push that, it increases in mass, because now you have put an input, energy is inputted into as a kinetic or potential energy. But obviously it's so minuscule that you cannot just weigh it. But its mass increases because it's got more energy stored into it. So the more energy you put into a system, the more mass it has. So by the same analogy, the more knowledge a person has, their net worth as a scholar increases. Again, that's just as a matter of principle. So what are the, I want to give you some minimum criteria for learning, Islamic learning. And once again, I'll make this into 3 blocks. So there are 3 blocks of knowledge I feel is necessary in our time. And it really depends on your expertise, whether you're expert in 1 or 2, and then you have a what we call encyclopedic knowledge in the other disciplines. Encyclopedic knowledge is not simple. Still, you got to know a lot. But you don't have to be an expert in every field, right? When I say, for example, quantum physics, if I say you got to know quantum physics, you don't need to know it as a theoretical physician. Like they have to know the equations, all the concepts. I mean, you don't need to know that, but you got to know the basics and the implications of quantum physics and whether it's proven or not, what are the evidence for it, and so on. And when I say you have to know astronomy, again, you don't need to know all the increasing, all the instruments and everything else. But you got to know what is a supernova, how a star is formed and ends its life, how a planet forms, what is dark matter, what are the evidence for Big Bang Theory. You got to know all of this, because they have theological implications. And actually, once I went to, I know a little bit of astronomy. I went to an astronomy night in Macquarie University. There were thousands of people, literally. It was amazing. And they had workshops and they had telescopes and things like that. I really urge you to look at the moon with a telescope. It's an amazing sight. And one of the astronomers were giving a class, and somebody asked, what is the nearest galaxy to Milky Way? And she said, it's the Andromeda galaxy. And the person said, how far is it? She couldn't answer, and I said, 2.5 million light years away. She was really, I said, yeah, I know for sure. Because I read up on that. And I was amazed that she didn't know about that fact as an astronomer. But my point with that is that you can really get good insight in all disciplines if you have the interest in it and that you don't waste your time and you speed up. So there are 3 blocks of knowledge that a scientist should have and a scholar should have, but at different levels depending on the expertise. The first one is that you have to be grounded in classical Islamic disciplines, obviously. And especially when we say classical Islamic disciplines, it's the usul subjects that come to mind. Usul subjects. Usul al-tafsir, usul al-fiqh, hadith, science, and usul al-din, theology. These are extremely important. And you have to know Arabic. Again, I'm talking about minimum. Like minimum is you got to be able to know Arabic or translate material like Fusha. You don't have to speak it. You don't have to speak modern standard Arabic. It would be nice, but you got to be familiar with Arabic to an extent that you can at least understand some key terminology and key expressions, the Quranic verses and so on. You have to have logic. Logic is a classic Islamic discipline. And if somebody does not study logic, how are you going to construct arguments? It's impossible. So these are some of the classical Islamic disciplines. Again, I don't want to go into detail because the purpose of this lecture is not that. The second block of knowledge is what we call contemporary religion and science. Like I mentioned some of the scientific disciplines like astronomy, physiology, biology, chemistry. Like these are, you must know at the encyclopedic level. Because somebody comes to you, a student, or it could be at the mosque, I'm confused about evolution theory, can you explain it please? And you got to be able to answer that in a satisfactory manner, not just dismiss, yeah, evolution theory, it's a lies and just basic arguments. I went through that. I asked these questions to imams when I was young. I was troubled by evolution theory. I went from mosque to mosque, and I was frustrated that nobody could give me an answer. They sometimes don't take you seriously, or they give an excuse and walk the other way because they don't know. Or they just give some basic blocks of cliche expressions. You gotta know also, other than science, world religions at the basic level. Like you cannot dismiss Hinduism as a worshipping cows. And like you gotta know Trinity as well as a Christian, how they understand it, before you can deal with it or respond to it. But we generally, Muslim scholars or sheikhs, they dismiss it in a very summary way. And it's very offensive. Like, how would you feel if a Christian priest dismissed Islam in that way? I mean, you can argue, you can provide responses, Islamic responses, which can be critical of those beliefs and practices. But you've got to do it in an informed manner. And secondly, you have to know philosophy. Thirdly, in that contemporary, again, at least at basic level. Like, for example, last night I was with a philosopher. So as a philosopher visiting Australia, we had dinner together with some friends. And a brother asked him, he goes, "You're a philosopher. How would you respond to an atheist philosopher about God?" Believe me, it's the hardest thing to do. Because they're very smart. Philosophers are usually smart. They have an answer for everything. And he goes, and he gave some very nice answers. I really liked it. He goes, why? My point here is that why? Because he knows philosophy well. And you can tell from his answer. He said, you tell to an atheist philosopher that being an atheist is impossible. Because an atheist means you are convinced that God doesn't exist. But you cannot prove that God doesn't exist in a philosophical sense. So the most they could be agnostics. They should say, I don't know if God exists. Because second point, if they are philosophers, they would have read Martin Buber's I and the Thou, which is a very important seminal book, which talks about human ego, human nature, human mind, and so on, and how we relate to ourselves, to relate to the world. He goes, in that book, he says that when you believe in something, the human mind is such that you can also assume the other way. And actually, you must do that to know the truth of what you believe. So tell this atheist or now agnostic philosopher that put aside your disbelief and entertain for a moment belief. Because when he does that, then his mind will open up to receiving some light. I really like that answer. I'm going to practice that if I find an atheistic philosopher. So you know how this is so important, isn't it? Unfortunately, we don't, well, maybe fortunately, we're not speaking to people outside who are ignorant. They have very good education. And I say fortunately because, unfortunately because it's very hard to convince them. Fortunately because they have critical thinking. Because someone who's not educated, they usually have a blind faith and they're blinded and they follow things blindly. And it's even more difficult to deal with those people. And also, you have to know modern history. You have to know research methods. Like these are all contemporary disciplines and science that unfortunately some sheikhs do not have. Again, I'm not being critical of sheikhs. I'm just pointing out that just because one studied classical discipline, they should not boast about, oh, I know it all. Well, if you don't know these areas, something is missing. And the third block of knowledge is about human being and humanities, knowing human psychology, society well, knowing about leadership skills, counseling skills, dealing with humans. And this is also very important. And I have seen very good sheikhs who've got excellent counseling skills, but I've seen the opposite as well. One friend who invited me to his talks, and I'm busy, you know, if I have time, I would, of course, go. He said, come, you must listen to me, you know, I give good sermons and good. I said, all right. I went once to the mosque, he was giving a class. There were 100 people, which was good. He spoke very eloquently. And in the end, I just went just to say, Assalamu alaikum, and leave. But there were people talking to him. And I'm just behind this guy, and this guy is asking the speaker about interest. He goes, I bought my house on interest loan. You know, I've got a family and all that. By borrowing money from the bank, you know, having a mortgage. What should I do? What do you think I should do? I swear to God, without looking at his face, he said this, go and sell it. To me, that was very inconsiderate, very arrogant. And this guy didn't know what to do. He just froze on the ground, and I don't know what he's done with his house. Like at least you can discuss what is your circumstances. How did you borrow it? Where did you borrow it? Give him alternatives. I don't know, interest-free loan opportunities. And there are fatwas on these things, you know. Like I thought that was a very inconsiderate response, which signaled to me that he does not know human beings and what they are encountered. And on top of that, there was some arrogance. So actually, when I say these 3 blocks of knowledge, classical Islamic disciplines, contemporary sciences, and religion and humanities, I'm not an expert in all of this. I'm the first one to admit that. I mean, alhamdulillah, I read widely, and I have read widely, and I continue to do so. But the more I read, the more I realize I don't know. And I think it's a lifelong process. But you got to have that minimum to start with, right? Minimum things, and then build that over time. And the more you interact with people, the more you teach and write and read, then your knowledge will increase. So the studying part is just the beginning. Self-learning continues over time in a lifelong process. And that is one of the most fulfilling aspects of learning. And actually, when you realize that it is I don't know enough, and maybe I can never know enough, and it's a lifelong process, that's when you become a true scholar. It's a bit like traveling at the speed of light. You know, they say if something that has matter will never be able to travel at the speed of light. You can try very hard, go very fast, but you'll never get there, because as you travel faster, your body increases in energy and weight, and which prevents you to reach even higher speeds. So it's exponentially. So knowledge is a bit like that. Like there's not a time when you can say, I know everything now. And I think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us like that on purpose. And that is, the knowledge that's out there is infinite. Our capacity to acquire that knowledge in a finite lifetime, a finite brain, is finite. But it's an amazing, this brain is an amazing organ. It's got 100 billion neurons. Each neuron makes between 600 to 10,000 synaptic connections. So that's trillions of connections. So the amount of knowledge it can absorb is also amazing. So you don't know your potential, unless you try, isn't it? So inshallah, not only as a result of this, I argue that not only as professional people has to get involved in Islamic learning, that they actually bring very important knowledge and competencies, provided they meet minimum standards of Islamic knowledge as well. And that starts with knowing the usul subjects and going from there. And also, by the same token, I would argue that scholars and sheikhs, those who studied in classical Islamic disciplines for 15 years sometimes, I meet some of our applicant students who've studied 13, 15 years in South Africa or India or Pakistan. And they've got a lot of knowledge, mashallah. Very good. They're very good at Islamic disciplines, certain classical books. But there's so much missing there as well, especially in scientific sense or in humanities and modern contemporary issues. And only when we combine or end this duality of knowledge, and that's when we gain wisdom, inshallah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Thank you.